The old man waited until the morphine had done its work before he spoke. His daughter sat beside the bed in a house that smelled of camphor and old paper, and she held his hand because the doctors had said it would not be long. He had worked 41 years inside government buildings. He had signed his name on documents that no living person outside a sealed archive had ever read. And on that last night, with the window cracked open to let in the sound of the street below, he told her what he had found inside the pre-1913 books. She wrote it down. She wrote everything. If this channel is new to you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. What you are about to hear does not appear in any approved curriculum. It was not taught in the universities your parents attended or the ones their parents attended before them. The story of what happened to the world's financial architecture before 1913 has been managed very carefully for over a century. What this man saw, what he carried for 4 decades without speaking, is the kind of account that reframes everything you thought you understood about money, about sovereignty, and about who has been making decisions on behalf of populations that never consented to any of it. His name was Edmund Callaway. He was born in 1881 in Pennsylvania. His grandfather had been a mill owner who lost everything in a financial panic, and the family had recovered slowly. Edmund was careful with numbers from a young age and could hold columns of figures in his head the way other children held songs. By 19, he had secured a position as a records assistant in a regional federal office, good enough at the work that he was transferred, promoted, and eventually moved to a position in Washington that required a clearance most people in his office had never heard of. He spent the majority of his working life inside rooms not listed on any floor plan available to the public. He handled documents that arrived in sealed cases and cross-referenced ledgers that predated the institution he worked for, transferred into federal custody from older offices and older systems. He did not ask questions out loud. He simply read what was placed in front of him, recorded what he was instructed to record, and went home every evening to a quiet house in a neighborhood where nobody talked about what they did for a living. He married. He had 1 daughter. His wife died young. He raised the girl alone in that quiet house, and he never told her what he did beyond what he put on tax forms. She grew up knowing her father handled government records, knowing he was trusted, knowing there were things he would not discuss. She was 43 years old when he finally talked. What he described that night, haltingly and with long pauses, was not what she had expected. She had assumed the deathbed conversation would be personal, a confession of regret, an old wound reopened. What he gave her instead was a description of a financial architecture so vast and so systematically obscured that she sat in silence for nearly an hour after he finished before she picked up her pen and wrote the first line. She spent the next 11 years trying to verify what he told her. She located 3 of the documents he referenced, confirmed the existence of 2 offices he named that had been folded into other departments without public announcement, and found in a Midwest University archive a partial ledger matching one of his descriptions. She was not a journalist and had no institutional backing. What she assembled was not a formal report, but a collection of notes, receipts, and handwritten summaries she kept in a fireproof box under her bed until the year she died. Her son found the box. To understand what Edmund Callaway saw, you have to understand what the pre-1913 books actually were as a functional category of document. Before the Federal Reserve Act was signed in December 1913, the United States operated its monetary and fiscal affairs under a completely different set of institutional arrangements. Most of what is publicly acknowledged about this period covers the broad outline: the debate over central banking, the competing interests of private finance and public sovereignty. What is rarely acknowledged is that the transition from the old system to the new one involved a transfer of records so enormous and so poorly documented that it created, inside the federal bureaucracy, a permanent archival gap. The gap was not accidental. Gaps of that kind never are. What looks like institutional disorder from the outside is almost always institutional design from the inside. and the people who designed the post-1913 system were not careless people. They were precise people who understood that the most effective way to suppress a record is not to destroy it outright, which leaves evidence of destruction, but to surround it with so much competing material, so many cross-references and administrative layers, that anyone looking for the record in question will exhaust themselves before they find it. Callaway described his first encounter with the pre-1913 books in terms that were almost physical. He said they were larger than any modern ledger. The paper was heavier, with a different texture, made from a material he could not immediately identify. The binding was not standard government issue. The clasps were metal, engraved in a style he had seen on buildings, not on books. When he opened the first one, he understood immediately that he was not looking at records produced by any office that existed in 1913 or any year close to it. He was looking at something much older. He said he knew this the way you know certain things without being able to immediately say why. The way a trained reader knows a text is ancient before examining the dating, because the assumptions embedded in the language are different in a way that precedes any single identifiable feature. The old books assumed things that no modern accounting system assumes. They assumed that land was not a commodity. They assumed that custodianship passed not by blood, but by demonstrated competence, and that the purpose of the record was not to establish ownership, but to ensure continuity, which was a value in itself, independent of any individual claim. This is where the account becomes difficult to navigate without the larger context. What Callaway was describing, without using the word, without knowing the word as most researchers who study this material now use it, was a set of records that belonged to the administrative infrastructure of the civilization that scholars working outside the approved channels now call Tartaria. And the reason that word matters, the reason it functions as something more than an internet curiosity or a fringe label, is that it points toward a body of evidence that has been accumulating in archives, in architectural surveys, in demographic records, and in the physical fabric of cities around the world for the better part of 2 centuries. Tartaria was not a fairy tale. It was not a conspiracy invented for digital forums. The name appears on maps produced by some of the most respected cartographic institutions in European history. Ortelius drew it, Blaeu drew it. The maps show a territory of enormous extent spanning from Eastern Europe through Central Asia to the Pacific, marked with place names and administrative divisions and trade routes that correspond to no state in any history book written after the 18th century. The standard explanation is that the maps were imprecise, that Tartaria was a geographic placeholder rather than a political reality. That explanation has never been satisfying to anyone who has looked at the maps carefully. The coastlines are accurate, the river systems are accurate, the mountain ranges are placed with a precision not supposed to be achievable with the instruments available at the time. The place names do not appear to be invented, they appear to be transcribed. And when researchers began comparing the administrative terminology in the pre-1913 books with the terminology on the Tartarian maps, the overlap was not coincidental. It was structural. Callaway did not know this. He was a records clerk, not a historian. He did not have access to cartographic archives or comparative linguistics, or the growing body of underground scholarship that would eventually connect these threads. What he had was a pair of careful eyes and 40 years of experience reading government documents, and what those eyes told him was that the books he was handling had not been produced by an American institution, or any institution he recognized. The formatting conventions were different, the notation systems were different, the units of account were different, and not in the way that pre-decimal currencies are different, but in a deeper way, as though the underlying assumptions about what money was and what it was for had been constructed from a completely different set of premises. He described one entry in particular that he never forgot. It was a transfer record. The originating authority was listed in a script he did not recognize, but below it, in a hand that appeared to have been added later, was a translation. The translated name was something he rendered in his daughter's notes as the Office of Continental Settlement. The receiving party was listed as a successor institution whose name Callaway recognized immediately because he worked inside one of its direct descendants. The transfer was dated. He gave his daughter the date. She wrote it down. When she tried to find any reference to it in publicly available financial histories, she found nothing. The date fell inside a period historians describe as administratively sparse, explained, when it is explained at all, as a consequence of institutional disorganization during national expansion. Callaway had a different explanation. He said it was a redaction. Someone at some point between the original entry and the ledger's transfer into federal custody had removed a significant volume of material and replaced it with silence, and they had done it professionally enough to make the absence look natural. This is a specific kind of skill. The ability to remove material from a long-running institutional record without creating obvious discontinuities, to make a gap look like the absence of events rather than the absence of documentation, is the kind of skill that gets taught and transmitted. The fact that it was practiced on the pre-1913 books with enough sophistication to fool trained archivists afterwards suggests that whoever was responsible had access to a long institutional tradition of exactly this kind of work. Callaway said he knew of at least 3 other clerks who had noticed what he noticed. 2 stopped working in the archive without explanation within a year. The 3rd transferred to another department and refused to discuss it. Callaway himself said nothing, kept his head down and continued doing his job. The only record of what he observed in those rooms exists in the notes his daughter took on the night he died. The architecture of the pre-1913 financial system, as Callaway described it from the books he handled, was not organized the way any contemporary economist would organize a financial system. It did not center on debt issuance. It did not use the same mechanisms for value storage. The books contained entries that Callaway described as equity records, but they were not equity in any modern sense. They were records of something closer to perpetual claim, a form of ownership that did not expire, did not depreciate, and did not transfer through any mechanism he recognized as either sale or inheritance. What it looked like, he told his daughter, was a record of stewardship. Not ownership. Stewardship. The distinction matters placed inside the Tartarian context. What researchers studying that civilization's administrative remains have found is a consistent pattern of governance built around exactly that concept. The land did not belong to individuals, it was held in stewardship by a layered system of custodians whose authority derived not from conquest or purchase but from ratified continuity, a chain extending back further than any written record that survived the Great Erasure. The Great Erasure. That phrase has been used by researchers working independently on different aspects of this material, arriving at it by different routes, some through architectural evidence, some through demographic records, some through map revision histories, and at least one, a retired academic who published under a pseudonym, reached it through a careful analysis of the exact kind of archival discontinuity that Callaway spent his career navigating from the inside. What they are all pointing at is a single coordinated process that unfolded over several decades in the 19th century, whose purpose was the elimination of the evidentiary record of a global civilization that had been dominant across the major landmasses until some catastrophic disruption broke its infrastructure and left its population scattered, its administrative systems in ruins and its institutional memory vulnerable to takeover by successor powers who had every reason to ensure the civilization they were replacing would not be remembered. The 1913 transition was not the beginning of this process, but a late phase of it. By the time the Federal Reserve Act was signed, most of the primary work had already been done. The maps had been revised, the place names had been changed, surviving administrative documents had been transferred into custody structures designed to limit access and accelerate decay, and the population that had lived under the old system had been absorbed into new national identities with origin stories and curricula that left no room for the older account. What remained in 1913 was a residue, a set of financial records that could not be easily destroyed because they were tied to ongoing claims and accounting obligations the successor institutions had inherited, whether they wanted to or not. The pre-1913 books existed because they had to. You cannot stop an accounting system mid-entry without creating irreconcilable discrepancies in every downstream record. The old books had to be maintained until the new system was stable enough to operate without reference to them. Callaway understood that his job, in part, was to manage the interface between the old record and the new one, to translate where necessary, to flag entries that did not map cleanly onto the new system's categories. The entries that refused to map cleanly were always the same kind. They were always records of perpetual stewardship claims associated with originating authorities, whose names did not correspond to any institution in the post-1913 world, and always associated with geographic territories that appeared on the old Tartarian maps but not on any contemporary administrative map. He said there were hundreds of them, that they had never been resolved, and that they were still in the books when he retired. His daughter asked him what that meant practically, what it meant that there were hundreds of unresolved stewardship claims from a civilization no approved history acknowledged had ever existed. He stared at the ceiling for nearly 5 minutes before he spoke, and when he finally answered, he said it meant the land had never legally changed hands, that whatever process had established the current ownership and governance structures of the affected territories, it had not gone through the accounting system, had not been recorded in any document acknowledging the prior claims. The transfer, if it could be called that, had been conducted outside the books. He said that was not how transfers were supposed to work. She asked him which territories. Based on the geographic descriptors in the originating entries, he believed the unresolved claims covered significant portions of North America, large sections of what was now Russia, parts of Central and Western Europe, and territories in the Southern Hemisphere he could not precisely identify, because the geographic notation systems in the old books did not correspond directly to any contemporary coordinate system he knew. He said that the people who designed the post-1913 system knew about these claims. The architecture of the new system, the way the Federal Reserve was structured and insulated from oversight, the way its records were kept and its accounts were categorized, had been designed with these unresolved claims in mind, not to resolve them, to bury them, to build a new accounting system so comprehensively on top of the old one that the old claims would eventually become inaccessible, not because they had been destroyed, but because the institutional knowledge required to read them would disappear along with the people who had that knowledge. He was one of the last of those people. He knew it. That was why he was talking. He told his daughter that in his final years he had compiled a record of what he had seen, not copies because copying was too dangerous, but descriptive notes detailed enough to allow a researcher with the right access to locate the entries he was referencing. She found them after the funeral in a bank safe deposit box in a city she had not known he ever visited, accessed with a key sewn into the lining of a coat he had not worn in 20 years. The notes were written in a personal shorthand that took her months to decode. What she found was a list of 47 entries from the pre-1913 books, each described in enough detail to be theoretically locatable, annotated with Callaway's assessment of its significance, and accompanied by a note about what he believed had happened to the corresponding documentation in the years since the transition. 31 of the 47, he believed, had been removed from the archive entirely. 9 had been misfiled in categories designed to make them invisible to any researcher who did not already know what they were looking for. 6 remained in their original locations in the pre-1913 books, apparently overlooked, protected only by the volume of surrounding material and the disinterest of the people tasked with managing the archive after Callaway's generation retired. One entry he marked with a symbol she did not understand. She asked him about it on that last night. He said it was not a transfer record or a stewardship claim, but something else entirely, something he had no framework for. He described it as a promissory notation, but the promise was not made by an institution or a person. It was made by a system described in the originating documentation as a self-correcting mechanism, a form of institutional guarantee built into the old civilization's financial architecture, specifically to address the possibility of catastrophic discontinuity. Not monetary in any narrow sense, temporal. A promise that the record would survive, that no matter what erasures were conducted or what new accounting frameworks were imposed, the actual underlying account of who held what and under what terms would persist, in a form that could eventually be recovered. He said he believed the record had persisted and was still recoverable. He did not know where it was, but the people who designed the post-1913 system believed they knew, and a significant part of what that system structure was designed to do was to prevent anyone from getting to it. His daughter wrote all of this down and then sat in silence while he slept. He did not wake up again. She drove home the next morning in fog and sat at her kitchen table thinking about what it would mean, practically, for unresolved stewardship claims from a pre-catastrophe global civilization to be sitting in books maintained by a federal archive that had no official interest in drawing attention to them. She thought about the land, all of it, the farms and cities and mountain ranges and river valleys sitting on top of an accounting record that had never been closed, a set of ledger entries that said, in the notation system of a civilization no approved history acknowledged, that this territory was held in stewardship by a chain of custodians whose succession had been broken not by any lawful transfer, but by a catastrophe so severe it had erased not just the people, but the memory of the people. And then she thought about what her father had said about the promissory notation, the self-correcting mechanism, the temporal guarantee. She thought about whether a system designed to survive catastrophic discontinuity would leave traces, whether the people who built it had understood that erasure would come and had prepared accordingly, hiding the record not in a single location that could be targeted, but distributed across a substrate harder to destroy than paper, harder to redact than ink, harder to discredit than testimony. She thought about the buildings because her father had said something about the buildings near the end. He said some of the geographic descriptors in the pre-1913 books corresponded to locations he had visited in person, and that in several of those locations he had noticed structural features that matched descriptions in the originating entries. Not vaguely, matched specifically in ways that told him the structures had been built during the Tartarian administrative period, not after it, bearing in their proportions and materials a form of encoded notation that corresponded to the accounting conventions he had spent his career reading in the old books. He said the buildings were ledger entries. He said the cities were archives. He said the architectural language of the civilization that built them was not decorative, but functional, a form of record-keeping so deeply embedded in the physical fabric of the built environment that it had survived erasure and transition simply because nobody had thought to destroy all the buildings at once, and by the time anyone with relevant knowledge looked closely enough to understand what the buildings were saying, most of the people who could read the language fluently were gone. This is consistent with what independent researchers studying the Tartarian built environment have been finding for decades. The buildings are not what official histories say they are. The timelines assigned to them are wrong. The construction methods attributed to them are impossible given the technologies the official timeline allows. The features that cannot be explained within the approved framework, pipe systems that predate any acknowledged plumbing technology, heating infrastructure embedded in pre-industrial walls, acoustic properties in rooms that should have none, foundations far deeper than any foundation should need to go. All of these are most coherently explained not by invoking alien intervention, but by taking seriously the possibility that the buildings were built by a civilization with sophisticated technology the approved historical timeline has chosen not to acknowledge. Callaway's contribution was not architectural. He was an accountant, but what an accountant sees in a set of books is different from what anyone else sees. He sees the flow. He sees the origins. He sees what came before the first line that anyone else is looking at, because the first line of any accounting period is always a summary of what was carried forward from the period before, and what the pre-1913 books carried forward was a set of accounts whose originating period corresponded to no recognised historical epoch. He said the opening carried forward balances in the oldest books he handled were staggering, not in monetary terms because the denominations were not directly convertible to anything he could benchmark against, but in terms of sheer volume, the number of entries, the number of territories, the custodial chains being tracked simultaneously. It was the accounting record of something enormous, something that had covered most of the planet's inhabited surface, long enough that the accounting system had developed layers of refinement and complexity no institution Callaway knew had come close to achieving. He said reading it was like finding a library inside a filing cabinet. When you look at the old books long enough, you stop being able to see the post-1913 world as something that had always been there. You start seeing it as a very recent construction built on top of something much older, and the seams are not hidden as well as the people who did the hiding believed. They are visible in the accounting records, in the buildings, in the maps that survived revision with their original place and names intact, and in the languages that persist in regions whose histories have been rewritten to remove any acknowledgement of what those languages were once used to administer. Tartaria was a word on a map and a word in the books. Callaway had seen it used not as a geographic label, but as an administrative designation used in originating entries as the name of the authority under which the stewardship claims had been registered, the name of the system that had issued the promissory notation, the temporal guarantee, the self-correcting mechanism that his daughter spent 11 years looking for and never quite found. She never quite found it because she was looking in the wrong substrate. Paper records, archives, university collections. The record is not primarily in any of those places. It is in the buildings. It is in the landscape. It is in the measurements encoded in the proportions of structures that have been standing for longer than any approved history will admit, waiting for someone who can read the accounting language of the civilization that built them to stop looking at them as art or ruin and start looking at them as what they actually are. Ledger entries, in stone, still open, never closed. The daughter's name was Margaret. She never published anything and never gave an interview. She kept the fireproof box and the decoded notes and the 3 documents she had located through years of careful searching, and gave them to her son with a letter explaining what his grandfather had seen and what she had spent the better part of her adult life trying to verify. The son still has the box. He has spoken to very few people about it. What he has said is that reading his grandfather's notes changed something fundamental in how he understood the land under his feet, the buildings he walked past every day without looking. His grandfather was not a man who dramatized things. He was a clerk, precise, and not given to speculation. What he had seen in those rooms and finally told his daughter in the last hours of his life was not speculation. It was accounting. That distinction mattered to the son the way it had mattered to his grandfather, and it mattered for the same reason. Because the moment you call something a theory, you have given people permission to dismiss it. Edmund Callaway had not theorized. He had read, cross-referenced, handled the documents with his own hands, and what he reported was not what he believed, but what he saw, but what he... The difference between those two things is the difference between a rumour and a ledger entry. And Callaway, who had spent his working life understanding that difference, was careful to maintain it even in his last hours. A clerk does not speculate. A clerk records. What Edmund Callaway had carried inside him for 41 years was not a theory. It was a set of observations made by a trained professional in the course of his ordinary duties, observations that happened to point towards something extraordinary, something that the institutions he served had spent considerable effort ensuring nobody, with his kind of access, would ever think to say aloud. The books are still there, not all of them, but enough. The 6 entries Callaway believed had been overlooked were in the archive when he retired. Whether they are still there is a question nobody with the clearance to check has publicly asked. What can be said is that accounting records of the kind Callaway was describing do not simply disappear. They accumulate implications. Every year that passes without those stewardship claims being formally resolved is another year of account that accrues in whatever system is still tracking them. Calloway believed a system was still tracking them. His daughter came to believe the same thing. What the son believes he keeps largely to himself, but he has been photographing buildings for years, quietly and systematically, in cities that appear in the geographic descriptors his grandfather noted. He has been measuring things, noticing features that should not be there, given the construction dates assigned to the structures he is examining. He has not yet found the key to reading what the buildings say, but he is looking. And that, in the end, is what Edmund Calloway wanted. Not exposure, not a scandal. He wanted someone to keep looking, the chain of attention to hold the way the chain of custodianship in the old books had held across catastrophe and erasure and the long silence of a civilization waiting to be recognized again. He told his daughter that the hardest thing about working with those records was not the secrecy. It was not the isolation of knowing what he knew and being unable to say it in any room that was not that final room. It was the weight of continuity, the sense that the people who had built the old system had understood something about time and accountability and the obligation of the present to the past that the new system had deliberately abandoned. They had understood that you cannot simply stop an account in the middle, that the books stay open until the balance is settled, that no erasure, however thorough, closes a ledger. It only defers the closing. The books are still open. Someone will have to close them eventually.